When analyzing a phenomenon which was called the spirit of enlightenment, French philosopher Tsvetan Todorov tried to explain why the enlightened thinkers of the 18th century were so zealous in their struggle against religion. He says that enlightenment derives from the precept of the natural life of man on earth, not obscured by some limitations from the outside. Todorov says, the paternalist care of pre-enlightenment time was primarily religious. It was against the religion that we shall have most critique to allow mankind to become masters of their family. So when Voltaire and Diderot were going against the religious dogmas and indeed mocking the religious institutions, they were not only incited by the fact that the divine interpretation of the social and political phenomena run contrary to the common sense, but also by the fact that the society and individuals, being captive to religious world view, are somewhat held captive by the precepts which are only based on references to gods or ancestors. So the religion tries to bump a person into the conventionally invaluable experience of the past, whereas a human must become a master of his life. However, the content bases were not discussed. The enlightened thinkers believed that it is important to remove the state from participation in the religious discourse, because otherwise religion becomes an instrument of repression. The generation of Voltaire preferred the so-called natural religion, which does not need any miracles or insights. It may have been that God started this world, started the clockwork of this universe, but now he has to take rest. So Todorov says about the creation and the development of the new resources, there is no more place for either verity, and we will have the multiplicity of truths coming from human to human. The 18th century set a fundament of a new view of the role of religion in the society, and the final stage of this program was the Marxist critique of the religion, which in turn grew from the German classical philosophy. Many of the German thinkers were quite liberal in their treatment of religion, but probably the greatest innovator was the philosopher Ludwig Feuerbach, 1804-1872. That's when he flourished. He was the person who spanned the bridge between Voltaire and Marx. What was the innovation of Feuerbach? The French thinkers, as say presented by Holbach, believed that the religion is the consequence of ignorance. Humans are somewhat lazy and stupid, and that's why they invent gods. And this was widely used by the states, and so the religion became an instrument of conscious mystification. The early enlightened thinkers told us. Feuerbach agrees with this, but he recognizes that such assumptions are insufficient. Why are they insufficient? They're insufficient because from his standpoint, the need for the divine is a part of human nature. Here we may raise an eyebrow because this is what all clerics tell us and the popes of all religions. from their standpoint, man can't deal without the concept of God, and it is indeed a part of our human nature. But the German philosopher treats it quite in a different key or tonality, if you will. He says, Feuerbach says, that man produces God out of himself. Man is a finite being, but from the standpoint of the collective nature, it is boundless and indefinite. And every person who knows that he will die wants to overcome death, so to come out of the framework of this temporality. This temporality is overcome by the projection, self-projection, whereby he uses his own individual qualities, bringing it to a superlative degree. Feuerbach says, before looking for an essence in himself, he posits it outside of his being, and he projects his own sense, objectivizes as a different essence. So the divine entity is the human entity which has been liberated from the individual boundaries and is viewed as an outside entity. So man ascribes to God various qualities based on what he or she is. As a result, Feuerbach says religion does not have its own content. By constructing the idea of God, man elevates his best qualities, and Feuerbach says that the source of inexhaustible source of divine qualities is the mystery of human indefinitely and interminably diverse sensitive entity. And this is how man makes himself the subject of his work, making it as an object. So he makes himself an object viewed from the outside. So in lay language, this means that that God is the projection of the best human qualities raised to a superlative degree. It is not mind that depends on God, but God depends on mind. And so religion consoles man because it is a medication produced by himself. The German author says, how could men find peace in God if God were different? Rest is only possible, peace is only possible in one's own essence. Man has his limitations, has his vices and imperfections. He acts badly, knowing what is bad, but as distinct from animal, he is in a position to perceive his own imperfection, and this conflict needs a certain elimination. So this is a problem of both big societies and separate individuals. What God does is helps us to liquidate this gap between the moral ideal and moral imperfection. How does he do that? This is not done through mind, because mind has hard time to bring us to terms with this conflict. This is done through feelings. Why does gospel communicate us that God is love? Primarily because love is a resource which is always in deficit, which is always missing. We want to be loved. This is how we stand, but love is imperfect as much as any other thing conceived and made by man. So we have a problem, because heart has a penchant towards the absolute and the unlimited, which is the need for constant love. And so we construct an ideal entity which can love us at all times and interminably, which is God. Love is God, and outside of love there is no God. Love makes man God, and God man. And I can only feel compassion for the being which is homogeneous to me, an entity in which I can see myself. And so Feuerbach asks himself a question. Why is it that Christ suffers? Why does he die? Because if God is an absolute perfection, why can't we deal without the suffering? Well, the thing is that love finds itself in suffering. In the understanding of sufferings, the suffering Christ symbolizes suffering as such. The Christian religion is not superhuman. It makes even human weaknesses sacred. God suffers, so God is that heart. So the mystery of a suffering God is the mystery of feeling. Religion is generally a very sensitive, sensual thing, which expands the boundaries of the sensual. Great Hegel announced, he said that the consciousness of man about God is consciousness of God, and that God does not need man. Feuerbach argues, as long as, and he certainly counteracts this with another statement, while he does not have the second eye, he's only an invented personality. God conceives and perceives himself only when there is an entity distinct from God, which indeed masks quite a commonplace philosophical axiom, which is that every act of consciousness must separate us from the object of thought itself. And only then the process of knowledge sets in. In the same way, God and man require each other to the extent that Hegelian thesis must be turned, that the knowledge of man about God is the knowledge about of our own entity. And so anthropology must become a true theology. So what do we have?
If you assume that Feuerbach is right, and the divine, one, celestial, supernatural, are only something that our own spirit generated if it is a construct made by human mind, then the question is, what's our take on this conceptual infrastructure that any religion builds about itself? What is a religious myth? Is it reminiscence of an event that really happened, or is it a product of human fantasy? Well, earlier people from Enlightenment, from Voltaire's Pléiade, were quite unambiguous. They insisted on that. The holy texts were invented and coined by ill-intended personalities. They wanted to cheat people on purpose to guarantee that the large social groups should remain under the spell of prejudice in misperceptions. Religion stands in the way and harms the reason. Later, the Enlightenment, as Feuerbach, Marx, and other predecessors would agree to that in part. The insight and guesses made by early generations of Enlightenment were deemed by them as insufficient. That is why later Enlightenment do critique of the Bible, and as they do it, they achieve two things. First, they seek from the holy text to extract some real basis that gave rise to these texts. For example, to understand why the Gospels keeps referring to the names and events, to those particular events, and not something else. The second objective is that these Enlightenment figures convincingly say that belief into supernatural forces is not just something typical of your mind or soul. It creates some social and political situation, and people in this way build their relations with the political world. I will dwell upon each of these in greater detail. Let me start with biblical criticism of the Bible of the 19th century, and I'll do that in passing because unfortunately we won't have enough time for that. So, in point of a critique of the Bible, goes back to much earlier than 19th century. The desire to understand how the Bible was created, what inspired those who created it. This is something that people wanted to know long before the Enlightenment. And when in 1435, when Byzantine fell under the attack of Turks and Seljuk, Europe was inundated with religious texts by Greek, liturgical in religious books. But the Western Church at that time, that is the 15th century, early 16th century, was in a profound disarray. 1,000 years after Christ, it lost that renovating drive that was typical of early Christianity and was deeply immersed in mundane things. And if you read the Decameron by Boccaccio, you will be easily convinced of that. Church has not one single healthy organ, claimed Pope Eugene IV 70 years before Luther. This was an important problem. Why? Because Christianity is there, you must work with it in some way. Intellectuals seek to address this problem. In which way? They think that one can and look at original sources. You must reread the Bible once again. It may well be when it was translated from one language to another, translators put in some mistakes, suspicious mistakes, and we must read the text of that. Maybe there were some additions. The European University, alongside with the Latin, are now going for active study of Greek and Hebrew. Well, they want to get rid of the mistakes made in translation, and Erasm of Rotterdam comes up with the doctrine of what is known as pure gospel. They seek for a simple religion. This is where Byzantine falls. New texts come up that can be analyzed. All this broth is preparing the Reformation to be kicked off by Luther. That is that these movements to simplify the cult and adopt prayers in one's national language started long before Luther. Luther interrupted this process in a revolutionary way. And therefore he did what he did. Therefore, the Reformation that happened simplified even further the communication of a believer with the holy text became your private matter. You read a Bible and you make your own conclusions. That's why Protestantism searched as the basis for the biblical criticism of the 19th century. Well, Kant did not enjoy simpler relations with Bible and young Hegelians. I can't even mention that. In 1835, an intellectual event happens. David Strauss publishes a 2-volume piece, Life of Jesus. This gives rise to a lot of excitement among the intellectual public. Why? Because Strauss makes quite curious conclusions there. As he analyzes the gospel, he proves that the holy texts include some myths, but these myths happened involuntarily. There was no ill intent. It happened spontaneously. Gospel myths, this is a quote, are not just deliberate products of poetic creation of some individuals. They are rather the product of a whole nation. Jesus became a figure of myths after his death. In this piece, very large and substantial piece, Strauss acknowledges that God exists as a source of natural laws. He works as one who follows what is known as natural religions, but at that he claims that if the absolute establishes law of nature, there can be no such thing as a miracle. There is no such thing as miracles. It means that biblical stories about miracles are just an insertion made in later times, because for miracles there is no room left in the Bible. Therefore, and hence, Jesus Christ should be named as Jesus, predicate Christ, which means God's Son, and thus reflects the miraculous nature of Christ, should be non-existent. Strauss thinks that he should do what he should do by consistently look at gospel texts and to show in great detail that all attempts to remove from them supernatural elements are in vain, or to put a shade on something that contradicts natural laws. In this sense, Gospels cannot be thought, in the strict sense of the word, historical narratives, and not only because they have supernatural element, but because they contradict one another. They do not correspond to the established facts of history and are not feasible in historic sense of the word. And Strauss says it was necessary to show that in cases where something comes up supernatural, it's much easier to understand how this happened about, how it got into narration, instead of contemplating how this could have happened. In other words, he points out a very simple circumstance. It's much easier to invent a miracle rather than to describe it or perform it. This book by Strauss provoked polemics. Well, Christianity has to be treated in a more rational way. It should be lighted by the light of reason. And it turned out that it was not God that inspired this biblical text. That gospel story has something that doesn't imply any miracles. Holy texts were very much evolving like many other epic texts, gradually through human effort. Strauss was not alone in these convictions. He had many followers. I do not even want to enumerate their names because there's no possibility for us to do it, but the contribution by the Germans of the criticism and critique of the Bible, it taught people working with the Gospel and Bible very much like you would work with any other book, without any special piety. Once this became possible, the researchers opened many new things about it. This became a landmark piece by Strauss. Many people leaned on that, and some would go even beyond him. For example, a great friend of young Marx, Bruno Bauer, refused to acknowledge that biblical myth creation was unintended and involuntary. He insisted that it was made out of ill intent. Where Ludwig Feuerbach went from here, we know it because he wrote about it in his piece somewhat later. And finally, the Bible was criticized by the classicists of Marxism. I will discuss later. What did they suggest? They assumed that they should apply historic approach towards gospel text, again, leaning on what the Germans did before them. Engels writes in his piece about early Christianity, what he does there is, in these works he is relying upon Neo-Hegelians, and amongst others he shows that the Apocalypse by John is not really the conclusive. Moreover, it was one to be wrote one of the first. And it must have been written in 68-69 AD, and he starts to deliberate on that in quite an interesting manner. Where does this dates come from? One of the central characters in our Apocalypse, that discusses all the horrors that will befall on humanity at the end of times, is this mythical animal that is marked in a certain way. Apocalypse says that those who have reason count the name of the beast, and this number is human number 666. What rubbish! Why? The first thing that comes to human mind, why is it 444, not 444, or 333? Huge plethora of remarkable figures that could be ascribed to this beast. As it turns out, it comes as no coincidence. One of university teachers of Engels points out that in ancient Hebrew, letters also may be read as figures, which means that beyond every letter, it may be also perceived as a figure. So, Nero Caesar, this, if you read it as letters, as figures, then it is 666. Nero is wrote in Latin, then we get 616. This figure also is as figure of Apocalypse among the early teachers of the church. So in Christian tradition, Nero is portrayed as one of the most avid, those who persecuted the Christians most vigorously, and his construct is something that is being evoked in the Apocalypse. So Engels draws our attention to yet another fragment. He wrote about another beast that is with 7 heads. Also one of the images of the Apocalypse, and Apocalypse tells us one of the heads was wounded but healed. Irenaeus, one of the fathers of the church, who says that this healed head is exactly Emperor Nero, because as the rumors went among the early Christians, was wounded, but again survived and would continue his operations. So Engels interprets Apocalypse. This is a quote. The beast was there and it is gone. 7 heads means 7 mountains where the wife sits, and 7 kings, out of which 5 fell. 1 is there and the other one is not yet to come. And when he does come, he will not stay long. Beast that was there and it's not gone is the 8th out of the 7. The wife that you saw is a great city that is a king among kings of the earth. Well, the great city is Rome, of course, and as to the kings, it quite clearly says that 5 of them fell. Now the 6th is reigning. After that, he will be again substituted by number 7, and then one of those 5 who fell will become again king. Well, this must be Nero, who was wounded but then recovered. Who are others? If we look at the life of 12 Caesars by Suetonius, we will find that the first Roman emperor is considered to be Octavio August, then Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero. Nero is number 5 in this list. In other words, Nero was succeeded by this particular character, Galba, and he is the one who is alone, who is existing up until now. Apocalypse describes his reign. This is actually 68 and 69 AD, because this emperor really reigned for a very short time. In June 68, January 69. However, the authors of the Apocalypse, he was a well-read man for his time and for his day. He also can predict the next king, who will stay in place not for long, because he realized he lives in an epoch of political turbulence. He was right, because the short reign by Galba ended in a soldiers' rebellion. The emperor was dethroned and murdered. Otto came to the throne, who stayed only several months. And then it all goes along these lines. The Apocalypse assumes that the reign of Galba will not be long, that it was not reliable, he will soon be removed above. General instability will not allow him to stay in place for long. And in fact, this is something that any political person who is sensible to politics can make these forecasts. But nowadays people go on television, but in the times of John the theologian, only paper was available. So this 8th king out of those who already were kings, this is again Nero, who sort of recovered and would come back to the throne, and it is at that time that they show who was known as false Nero. Well, let's sum up. Logic of the Enlightenment is such that prescribes that man is maker of his own fate, autonomous and independent of any other third-party forces, especially supernatural forces, makes people who work in enlightenment be very strict about religion. Within the 19th century, this criticism was put in order and built into a system. What does the system look like? Bastions of Christian belief are undermined from 2 sides. First of all, they study the religious sentiment and its origins. Feuerbach seeks to prove to us that man is God to oneself, and as supernatural, he thinks that this is the absolute of one's best qualities and properties. In other words, religion has anthropological nature, and there's no God other than man himself, alas. On the other hand, critique of the Bible says that holy texts did not come from the heavens. They were written very much like many other texts in a number of centuries, in a matter of centuries, and this happened under the influence of very much mundane events. Moreover, the critique of the Bible becomes a great success. This work to demystify Christianity continues again. Well, let's look what happened out of it. If we think of it, that Feuerbach and others are right, then supernatural, in this common sense of the word, is non-existent. If you think that holy texts are just a piece of literature, then if it both fears we have only doubts, what is left to us when we want to contemplate religion? Well, there is some disputable or some stable facts that we can rely upon. Well, people who worked in Enlightenment later say that this is religion as a social institution. Yes, but it's like a pillar. What do we pay attention at if we examine it from this perspective? We're surprised to see that in diverse geographical situations and epochs, the same phenomenon, institutes who were guided by worshipping the supernatural. Why? They all stabilize social systems in a remarkable way, a stabilizer that supports the balance in the system and stands in the way of their change. In other words, religion as a political institution always and everywhere does the same thing. It supports the government and the ruling regimes, supporting their government with supernatural sanctions. As to Christianity, Marx, as early as in his early youth, wrote, as he analyzed the social principles of Christianity. Social principles of Christianity, say, would justify the slavehood, would justify and glorify serfdom, and also exploitation of proletariat. Well, they explain the need for the existence of classes, of those who would be oppressed and those who would oppress, and they just want the oppressor to be benevolent towards the oppressed. The social principles of Christianity justify all the horrendous things that happened, explaining it either by the original sin or by the ordeals that the Lord in His grace sends to humans. Social principles of Christianity worship self-humiliation, humility, subordination, all the qualities that are typical of the lower classes. Well, this is a lot in terms of hypocrisy. End of the quotation. Did the religion do that during the years? All the classics of Marxism are probably vilifying that. But of course, when we speak about the Christianity, we should make certain reservations. The Catholic Church tried to rule the society, seeking to put aside secular government. In Byzantine tradition, these sort of encroachments were not really feasible because there, for a number of reasons, the subordination of the church before the throne may have reached absolute obsequious limits. Well, the Catholic Church, for example, generated a phenomenon that was known as theology of liberation. Those who followed it could, in Latin authoritarian regimes, would proclaim them ungodly, would take up Kalashnikov's gun and try to establish the kingdom of Christ in this sort of very specific Well, in Orthodox Christianity is impossible, quite the opposite. Our church so much merged with Tsar's government that it nearly was drowned together with the monarchy in 1917. In this way, I'm trying to wrap up using this 35 minutes that I counted on. Well, the Enlightenment is an outstanding doctrine. It is such because it helps us improve our outlook at the world, even today. In the 21st century, one of the most important contributions into the triumph of reason and true emancipation of man has become the critique of the religion commenced in the 18th century by the Enlightenment. And we continue that the champions of these think, they say that anti-secular humanism follows that will generate the good without no God, or no need for God whatsoever. Religion, of course, is an objective phenomenon, and nobody disputes that. But its root should be sought not only where religion seeks to explain itself. These roots are not in the heaven, they are on earth. Religion is the product of human spirit, and in this sense it should be open for criticism. This is unconditional and quite clear. Moreover, this criticism is something that it, particularly in Russia, is something that it misses badly, because, well, the circumstances are clear why it is the case. Although I was been thinking about it. Once, 100 years ago, once the Orthodoxy apologized for this pun, nearly kicked the bucket. So to link Orthodox Christianity to autocracy, as Georgy Khidotov put it, means to link it to the corpse, to bury it alive. These are words well, embossed in gold. Well, dear God, this is all that I wanted to say to you. I would like to thank you for your attention.